The gavel came down before she could breathe. "Sold," Edgar Blackwell announced, his voice rolling across the square like a man pricing cattle. $8.40. The crowd laughed. Rosalie Mercer stood on that wooden platform in the middle of Iron Bluff, her wrists bound at her sides by nothing more than shame and the suffocating silence of people who watched and did nothing. Her own father stood 3 feet away, pocketing the coins without once meeting her eyes. $8. That was what 26 years of a woman's life cost on a Tuesday morning in 1884. Nobody moved to stop it. Nobody asked what she wanted. Not until a man at the back of the crowd folded his arms, looked straight at Edgar Blackwell, and said the 4 words nobody in this town had ever dared to say out loud. If that were you standing up there, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you've never subscribed to this channel, now is exactly the moment to do it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is only the beginning, and the ones coming after it are going to leave you speechless. While you're at it, drop a like and tell me in the comments. What city and country are you watching from right now? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Iron Bluff, because what happened next changed everything. The morning it happened, Rosalie had been awake since before the roosters. Not because she was nervous. She told herself that anyway. She'd been telling herself a lot of things lately. That her father wouldn't actually go through with it, that someone in town would say something, that the law would step in or a neighbor would speak up, or the ground would open and swallow her whole before she had to stand on that platform. She'd been wrong about all of it. She dressed in her cleanest blouse, which wasn't very clean, and pulled her dark hair back the way her mother used to do it before her mother had the good sense to die and leave this family behind. That was a terrible thought. Rosalie knew it was terrible the moment it crossed her mind, and she let it stay there anyway, because terrible thoughts were honest, and honesty was the only thing left that still belonged to her. Her father, Clement Mercer, was already up. She could hear him through the thin wall, pacing, muttering to himself the way he did when the drinking hadn't settled his nerves the way he needed it to. He owed money to half the county. That wasn't new. What was new was that he'd run out of things to sell. Except her. She didn't ask him about it when she came into the kitchen. There wasn't anything to ask. The notice had been pinned to the notice board at the general store for 3 days, and she'd read it herself. Arrangement of domestic service. Female, 26 years, capable in figures and keeping of accounts. Inquire Clement Mercer. It was dressed up in language that made it sound almost reasonable. Rosalie had stared at those words until they blurred. Clement poured himself a cup of coffee and didn't offer her one. "Shouldn't take long," he said, like he was talking about a trip to the feed store. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 12 different things she wanted to say. She said none of them. They walked to the square together in silence. Iron Bluff was not a large town. It had one main street that turned to mud every time it rained and baked to cracked clay. Every time it didn't, a church that held 30 people if they didn't mind standing, and a general store that doubled as a post office, and occasionally a barber shop. It had exactly the number of people required to make public humiliation feel complete, enough to form a crowd, few enough that every face was familiar. Edgar Blackwell was already there. Rosalie noticed him before she noticed anyone else, which she suspected was the way he preferred it. He was not a tall man, but he stood in a way that made you think he was. Shoulders back, jaw set, a quality of stillness about him that wasn't peace. It was the stillness of something waiting. He owned the freight company, the largest parcel of land in the valley, and though nobody said it out loud, most of the men who were supposed to enforce the law in this county. He wore a dark coat even in summer, and had the kind of handshake that always lasted a half-second too long. He caught Rosalie's eye across the square and smiled at her. It was the smile of a man who had already counted his money. Clement Mercer gave a small nod in Blackwell's direction, the nod of a man paying off a debt. And Rosalie understood, in that moment, what this actually was. Not an arrangement, not domestic service. This was a transaction between 2 men about a woman who hadn't been asked. The platform was a produce crate with a plank laid across it. She stepped up onto it herself because nobody offered a hand. The crowd was maybe 40 people. Some of them she had known since she was a child. The Miller brothers, who used to steal apples from her father's tree. Mrs. Holt from the dress shop, who had once told Rosalie's mother that Rosalie was too clever for her own good. Old Pete Danforth, who ran the livery, already grinning at some private joke she hadn't been told yet. Blackwell stepped up beside her. Not on the crate, beside it. He looked out at the assembled crowd with an expression of civic pride, like he was about to cut a ribbon. "Folks," he said pleasantly, "we have a simple matter of resettlement here. Miss Mercer is in need of a new household situation, and I've agreed to help facilitate." Facilitate. That was the word he chose. Someone in the crowd laughed. Not at Blackwell. At her. Rosalie fixed her eyes on a point at the far end of the street where it met the open sky, and she kept them there. The bidding started at $3. She heard the numbers being called out and felt them at a physical remove, like she was watching herself from the ceiling of that square. $3.50. 4. A man she didn't recognize made a joke about whether she could cook, and several people laughed again. Clement Mercer stood to her left and stared at his boots. $4.20. 5. 6 1/4. She thought she might vomit, and then she thought that if she did, it would be the most honest thing that had happened in this square in a long time. $7.50. She heard Blackwell murmur something low beside her, confirmation maybe of what he already planned to spend. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on that far horizon and breathed through her nose and told herself that this was temporary. She didn't entirely believe it, but the telling was something to do. $8, said Blackwell, with the satisfied finality of a man who has never not gotten what he wanted. A pause. The kind of pause that means it's over. $8.40, said a voice at the back. The crowd shifted. She didn't see him clearly at first, just a gap opening up in the assembled people as they turned to look, the way a crowd always turns toward something unexpected. Then they parted a little more, and she saw him. He wasn't remarkable to look at. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it with some surprise because she didn't know what she'd expected, something dramatic. What she got was a man of medium height in a work coat that had seen several hard winters, dark hair that needed cutting, standing with his hands in his pockets like he'd wandered into a church picnic and wasn't sure of the protocol. He was looking at Blackwell. Blackwell turned to look at him with the expression of a cat who has spotted an unfamiliar dog in its territory. Not frightened, just very, very interested. "Silas Granger," Blackwell said, pleasantly enough. "Didn't know you came to town on weekdays." "Needed supplies," the man said. He had a low voice, unhurried. He looked at Rosalie then, not the way the men in the crowd had been looking at her all morning. He looked at her the way you look at a person. "What is it she actually wants?" Nobody answered him. "I'm asking," he said, not loudly. "The woman standing up there, what does she want?" The crowd went strange and quiet. Not the laughing quiet from before. A different quiet. The kind that happens when someone says something so simple that no one can figure out how to argue with it. Mrs. Holt from the dress shop made a small noise that might have been discomfort. Blackwell smiled tightly. "That's not really how these arrangements—" "I know how they work," Silas Granger said. "I'm asking anyway." And then he looked at Rosalie again. And this time he waited. Nobody had waited for her answer in a very long time. She felt it like a physical thing, the waiting, the fact of it. She was aware that the crowd was watching her, that Blackwell was watching her, that her father was watching his boots, that $8.40 in coins was sitting somewhere in this conversation, waiting to change hands and change her life, and that the man at the back of the crowd was still just waiting. Her throat was dry. "I want to go somewhere I'm not being sold," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. But in that strange, suspended silence, everyone heard it. Someone in the back of the crowd coughed. The Miller brothers exchanged a look. Blackwell's expression did something complicated and then smoothed itself out again. Silas Granger nodded, like she'd given him a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "Then that's where you'll go," he said. He reached into his coat, produced the coins required, and paid them. Not to Blackwell, not to the crowd, but to her father, directly, with the brief and businesslike manner of a man settling an honest debt. Then he looked at Blackwell one more time. "Transaction's done," he said. "She goes with me." Blackwell stared at him. There was something in that stare that Rosalie would think about later, a calculation she couldn't quite read. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was something colder and more precise than angry. "Of course," Blackwell said, after a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Of course she does." Rosalie stepped down off the crate. Nobody offered her a hand for that either, but she didn't need one. They walked to the edge of town without speaking. She didn't know what she was doing. She was following a man she didn't know away from the life she'd spent 26 years failing to escape, and she kept waiting for the part where it made sense. His wagon was hitched behind the livery. An old roan horse with patient eyes and a load of flour sacks and iron nails in the back. He untied the horse and climbed up and made room on the bench without a word. She climbed up. They were almost to the edge of town before she said anything. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You paid almost $9 for me." He was quiet for a moment. "I paid $9 so you could leave." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said again. "It's not." She watched the buildings thin out and the road open up ahead of them. Behind them, she was aware, without looking, that Edgar Blackwell was still standing in that square, watching. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My ranch, about 8 miles up into the hills." "And what happens when we get there?" He thought about that. "I've got ledger books going back 4 years that I haven't been able to make heads or tails of. Your father mentioned you were good with figures." She stared at him. "You bought me to do accounting?" "I bought you to leave," he said, with a patience that was either genuine or very well practiced. "You can do whatever you want once you get there. If you want to help with the books, you're welcome to. If you want to sleep for 3 days, I've got a spare room. If you want to walk back to town in the morning, the road's there." Rosalie looked at the road ahead, then at him. "You're not what I expected," she said. "People say that," he said, without any particular vanity about it. The horse plodded forward. The town fell behind them. The hills in the distance were the pale gold of dry grass in summer, and the sky above them was the kind of blue that only happens when the air is clean and the world is quiet and you're far enough away from everything that tried to swallow you to take a real breath. She was not safe. She knew that. Edgar Blackwell's face when Silas Granger paid those coins, that smoothed-out expression, that 1 cold second too long. She'd spent her whole life reading people, and she knew what that expression meant. It meant, this isn't over. But she was out of that square, and she could breathe. And for right now, on this particular road, that was going to have to be enough. The ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt track that wound through stands of dry pine and came out unexpectedly into a clearing. It was not the kind of place you'd put on a postcard. The fencing needed work. The barn door hung at a slight angle that suggested the hinges had given up on principle, if not practice. There was a vegetable garden that had been planted with ambition and maintained with intermittent attention, half of it thriving, half of it making its own decisions. But it was real. That was what struck her. It wasn't a performance of something. It was just a place where a person actually lived and worked and ate and got tired and tried their best. Silas pulled the wagon up near the barn and climbed down. "Kitchen's through the front," he said. "There's bread from yesterday. I don't know if it's still good." "I'll figure it out," she said. She went inside. The kitchen was plain and functional, and someone had washed the dishes recently but not dried them properly. There were 4 different notebooks on the table, and 3 of them were open to pages of figures that had been attempted and crossed out and attempted again in what she recognized immediately as the math of a man who was good at running cattle and considerably less good at running accounts. She picked up the nearest notebook. The numbers told a story she didn't yet understand, but she could see the shape of it. Irregular entries, strange deductions, a series of freight charges that repeated at intervals with no corresponding deliveries that she could find. Something was wrong here. Not with his math, with the numbers themselves. She set the notebook down carefully. She'd seen numbers like these before, in the margins of her father's papers, in the accounts that had driven him from one desperate scheme to the next. She'd never been able to explain to him what he was looking at. She wasn't sure she could explain it to herself yet. But she would. She went and checked on the bread. It was fine. She made herself a plate and sat down at that table full of wrong numbers. And she ate, and she thought, and outside the window the hills were going gold in the late afternoon light. And somewhere out there Edgar Blackwell was still smiling that smooth, calculated smile. And Rosalie Mercer, who had been sold for $8.40 at a produce crate auction in the town square of Iron Bluff, picked up a pencil, and started at the beginning. The bread was stale enough to require effort, but not so far gone that it was inedible. Rosalie ate it standing at the kitchen window because she wasn't sure yet whether she was allowed to sit. That was the thing about kindness from strangers. You didn't know the rules of it. You didn't know what it cost or when the bill would come due. She'd learned that the hard way enough times that she'd stopped expecting generosity to be free. Outside, Silas was unhitching the horse. He worked with the unhurried competence of a man who had done this particular task 10,000 times and saw no reason to make a production of it. He talked to the horse while he worked, low, even tones she couldn't make out through the glass. The horse's ear swiveled toward him like a weather vane. She turned back to the notebooks. There were 4 of them, and she'd already established in her first 10 minutes at the table that 3 of them were essentially useless. Not because Silas had done anything dishonest, but because he'd been trying to keep accounts the way someone had once told him to keep accounts, which bore no relationship to the way his ranch actually functioned. He'd recorded things twice when they should have been recorded once, omitted things that absolutely needed to be there, and used a system of abbreviations that appeared to mean different things in different months. The 4th notebook was different. It was older, the cover worn soft, and the entries in it were made by a different hand, careful, precise, and increasingly alarmed. She could see it in the pressure of the pen strokes, which deepened as the pages progressed. Whoever had kept this book had been watching something happen and hadn't known what to do about it. She flipped to the last page with writing on it. It was dated 14 months ago. The final entry was 3 words long. This isn't right. She sat down at the table. She hadn't decided to sit. Her legs just made the decision without consulting her. She heard the front door and looked up. Silas came into the kitchen, saw her at the table with the notebooks, and stopped. "You found the old one," he said. "Who kept this?" He was quiet for a moment. He went to the stove and checked the coffee that was still sitting from that morning. She could tell from the smell that it had gone past saving, but he poured himself a cup anyway and drank it standing up like a man who doesn't complain about small inconveniences. "My uncle," he said. "Hector. He ran this ranch before me, left it to me when he died 14 months back." Rosalie looked at the last entry again. "This isn't right." "What killed him?" "Heart." He set down the cup. "That's what Doc Renner said." There was something in the way he said it, not accusation, not certainty, just the particular weight of a thought you've had too many times alone. "But," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was part surprise and part something more careful. He was 61 and healthy as a draft horse the spring before he died. And in the 6 months before he went, he was anxious. In a way he hadn't been before. He wouldn't talk about it, just kept saying he was working something out. She looked at the notebooks on the table. She looked at the final entry. "Silas," she said. "Who handles your freight?" He said the name before he'd finished thinking about whether to say it. "Blackwell Freight." She didn't sleep well that first night. That wasn't a surprise. She hadn't slept well in months, and her body had no particular reason to expect that a change of location would change the fundamental restlessness of a mind that wouldn't stop working. The spare room was small, and the mattress had a dip in the center, and the window faced east, which meant she saw every stage of the dawn whether she wanted to or not. What she hadn't expected was to feel, somewhere around 3 in the morning, something that wasn't exactly safe, but was adjacent to it. Like the air in the room had less threat in it than any room she'd occupied in recent memory. She lay there and thought about freight charges. Blackwell Freight handled the movement of goods for nearly every rancher in the valley: cattle, supplies, grain, equipment. It was the only freight operation of any real size within 40 miles, which meant that if you needed things moved, you used Blackwell, because there was no one else. Rosalie had grown up hearing her father complain about freight costs the way he complained about weather, as a fact of life, something you couldn't change, something you just had to absorb. What she'd seen in the older notebook was a pattern of charges that didn't quite line up with deliveries. Small discrepancies at first, the kind that could be honest mistakes. But they accumulated, and they accelerated. She needed to see more records. She needed to see records that weren't here. In the morning, Silas made eggs. They were slightly overcooked, which she didn't mention, and he put them on the table without ceremony and sat down across from her and ate his own in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the strange thing about it. She'd spent her life around silences that felt like held breath. Her father's silences, which were always the prelude to something. The town's silences when she walked down the street and people looked away from the difficulty of what they'd done or failed to do. This was just a man eating eggs. "I want to look at the freight records," she said. "Everything going back as far as you have." He chewed, swallowed. "There's a box in the barn. Haven't touched it since the funeral. I want to see it." He looked at her steadily. "What do you think you're going to find?" "I don't know yet," she said. It was honest. She was operating on instinct and pattern. The same instinct that had let her see, at 12 years old, that her father's creditors were charging him compound interest they'd described to him as simple interest, and the same pattern she'd felt in her chest when she'd read those last 3 words in Hector Granger's notebook. "This isn't right." "I'll get it after breakfast," he said. She finished her eggs. They were overcooked, but she was hungry, and she'd eaten worse, and there was something to be said for food that nobody was using as a negotiation. The box was a wooden crate, the kind that had originally held glass bottles, now repurposed to hold paper. It was not organized. It was not close to organized. It was the record-keeping of a man who had kept everything and sorted nothing, which was actually, Rosalie understood, better than the alternative. A man who sorted could also discard. Hector Granger had kept it all. She carried the crate to the kitchen table and spent the rest of the morning making order out of it. Silas appeared periodically in the doorway, watched for a few minutes without speaking, and disappeared again to do whatever the ranch required of him. She appreciated that about him. The not hovering, the not explaining, the simple trust that she was doing something and should be allowed to do it. By noon, she had the records arranged by year and by type. By mid-afternoon, she had isolated the freight records specifically. And by the time the light was going gold and long through the kitchen window, she had found what Hector Granger had found. She sat back in her chair and looked at the numbers for a long time. They weren't dramatic. That was the thing about a well-executed cheat. It never looked dramatic up close. It looked like a rounding error. It looked like a billing discrepancy. It looked like the kind of small confusion that reasonable men sort out with a handshake and an adjusted invoice. But when you looked at it across 4 years, across dozens of entries, across a consistent and very particular pattern of inflation that applied to certain routes on certain months at certain intervals, it stopped looking like confusion. It looked like a system. Silas came in as the sun was setting and looked at her face before he looked at the table. "You found something," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She walked him through it methodically, not with excitement or alarm. She made herself plain and precise the way she'd always had to be when explaining numbers to men who'd already decided they weren't going to understand. She showed him the pattern. She showed him what a legitimate freight charge should have looked like, based on the distances and weights documented in his uncle's ranch records. She showed him the difference. When she finished, Silas sat quietly for a moment. "How much?" he said. Not a question exactly. The voice of a man preparing himself for information he already partially knew. "Over 4 years? On this ranch alone?" She looked at the number she'd written at the top of the page. "I make it about $430. He was quiet. "Silas, every rancher in this valley uses Blackwell Freight." He was still quiet. She let him be quiet. Some information needed a minute to land before a person could respond to it reasonably. "If the pattern holds across all of them," she said, "we're talking about thousands of dollars. Over years. Possibly more." He looked at the notebooks, then at her. "My uncle figured it out," he said. "I think so, yes. And 3 months after he figured it out, he had a heart attack." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. That night, after Silas had gone to bed, and the ranch was quiet except for the sounds a building makes when the temperature drops, Rosalie sat at the kitchen table and thought about what they had and what they would need. What they had was 1 ranch's worth of freight records, the notebook of a dead man, and a pattern of numbers that would be very clear to someone who knew how to read it and completely invisible to anyone who didn't. What they would need, if this was going to mean anything beyond the 2 of them sitting in a kitchen feeling angry about it, was evidence from other ranches. She thought about the law. Iron Bluff had a sheriff named Court Dillman who had worked for Edgar Blackwell before he'd worked for the county, a fact that everyone in town knew and discussed in the same resigned tones they used for bad weather and poor harvests. The county judge was a man named Pemberton, who had ruled on 3 separate land disputes in the past 2 years, all 3 of them in Blackwell's favor, and who had a brand new house that didn't match what a county judge's salary should support. Going to the law inside Iron Bluff was not an option. She'd known that before she'd even started making the freight records tell their story. The question was what options were left. Federal marshals were a different matter. They operated out of the territory capital, which was a considerable distance away, and they required substantial documentation before they'd move on a man of Blackwell's standing. Substantial was the word she kept returning to. What she had was suggestive. What she needed was overwhelming. She needed the other ranchers. She needed their records. And she was a woman who had been publicly auctioned in the town square 5 days ago, which meant that walking into those same ranchers' homes and asking for their trust was going to require something that felt, in the small hours of that kitchen, close to impossible. She picked up a pencil and started making a list. The first person she approached wasn't a rancher. It was Mabel Finch, who ran the boarding house on the north end of Iron Bluff's Main Street, and who had, in 30 years of operating in that town, been paid rent by virtually everyone who passed through. Rosalie had chosen her for 2 reasons. First, because Mabel Finch had been the only person in that square who had not laughed, who had, in fact, looked at the proceedings with an expression of tight-mouthed fury she hadn't quite been able to suppress. Second, because anyone who kept a boarding house kept receipts. She came into town on the 3rd morning when Silas was out checking the north fence line, and she walked in through the back door of the boarding house the way Mabel's regular suppliers did. Mabel Finch looked up from her account book and did not look surprised to see her. "Figured you'd come sooner or later," Mabel said. Rosalie sat down across from her. "I need to look at your freight records." Mabel studied her. She was 60 or so, with the kind of face that had started out stern and softened only slightly with the years. Not from mellowing, Rosalie thought, but from a gradual acceptance that the world was what it was, and fury was expensive. "And what are you going to do with them?" Mabel asked. "Find out how much Edgar Blackwell has been stealing from you." The silence lasted several seconds. "How much?" said Mabel. "I don't know yet. I need to see the records first." Mabel looked at her for a moment longer, then reached under the counter and produced a ledger that she dropped on the table with the finality of a woman who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question. "He charged me $14 to move 2 crates of linens from the depot," she said flatly. $14. "From the depot, that is 6 blocks from this building. You tell me what you find." Rosalie opened the ledger and found the entry inside of 30 seconds. Then she kept reading. It was there, the same pattern, smaller amounts because Mabel's freight volumes were smaller, but the same consistent inflation, the same intervals, the same particular style of dishonesty that had the same signature all the way through it, like a man who signs his name the same way every time, even when he's trying to be invisible. "How long has this been going on?" Mabel asked quietly, watching her read. "At least 4 years on the records I've seen. Possibly longer." Mabel was silent for a moment. "My husband used to say he thought the numbers were wrong. I told him he was imagining things." She paused. "He died 2 years ago." Rosalie looked up at her. "Don't look at me like that," Mabel said, with a brittleness that wasn't quite anger. "He had a bad heart. I know what it was. I just—" She stopped. "I told him he was imagining things." "You didn't know," Rosalie said. "No," said Mabel. "I didn't." She straightened. "What do you need?" The problem was that not everyone was Mabel Finch. Most of the ranchers in the valley were men who had watched Rosalie Mercer get auctioned on a produce crate and had varying levels of complicated feelings about her appearance in their homes, asking to look at their private financial records. Some of them were embarrassed by what they'd witnessed and covered it with hostility. Some of them didn't see what an auction had to do with accounting. A few of them, the ones who owed Blackwell the most, were outright afraid. She went anyway. She went to the Harmon place, where old Tom Harmon met her at the door with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had been hoping she wouldn't come. She sat at his table and showed him what she'd found in the records he reluctantly allowed her to look at, and she watched the expression on his face change from resistance to something more complicated and finally to a flat, exhausted anger. "I thought I was bad at math," he said. "You're not bad at math. The numbers were designed to be confusing." He stared at the figures she'd laid out for him. "My boy almost lost this place last winter. I had to borrow against the cattle to cover the freight costs because they came in higher than I'd budgeted. He paused. I budgeted right. The bills were wrong. She went to the Calloway place, where the widow Daria Calloway had been managing on her own for 3 years since her husband passed, and had already half convinced herself to accept a buyout offer from Blackwell because she couldn't make the numbers work no matter how hard she tried. Rosalie spent 4 hours at that table. When she left, Daria Calloway was not accepting the buyout, and Rosalie had copies of 2 years of freight records folded carefully into her bag. She went to the Morrison brothers, who ran sheep on the south end of the valley, and spoke mostly in short sentences and traded looks between themselves when she showed them the pattern in their accounts. The older one finally said, "We thought it was the industry," meaning that they'd assumed freight costs were simply what freight costs were everywhere for everyone, and that their unhappiness with the numbers was ignorance rather than instinct. "It's not the industry," Rosalie said. The younger one leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "What are we going to do about it?" "That's what I'm working on," she said. "Us." What she hadn't accounted for was how it would feel to be in those kitchens. Not the hostility. She'd expected varying degrees of that and prepared herself for it. What she hadn't expected was how people's faces changed when she showed them the numbers. Something happened in those moments that she watched over and over in kitchen after kitchen, face after face. The moment when the confusion they'd been carrying on, the quiet, private shame of, "I don't understand why this doesn't add up," became something else. Became recognition. Became anger, yes, but also something like relief. The relief of knowing that the thing they'd doubted themselves about was real. She had spent 26 years being told, in various explicit and indirect ways, that her gift with numbers was either something to be suspicious of or something to be exploited. Her father had used it, brought her the accounts when he needed them fixed, put her away when the fixing was done. The townspeople had treated her as either odd or threatening, depending on their mood. Nobody had ever looked at her the work she was doing in those kitchens, the way that Tom Harmon looked at her when she showed him exactly where his money had gone and how much there was of it. Like what she could do was worth something. She drove back to the ranch on the 4th afternoon of these visits with her bag full of copied records, and her mind already reorganizing the data into the structure it needed to be in, and she found Silas sitting on the front step with an expression she didn't like. "Someone came by," he said. She stopped. "One of Blackwell's men. Harlan Deer." He said the name like he was identifying a particularly unpleasant species of snake. He said Mr. Blackwell wanted to extend his personal regards regarding your situation and to let you know that you're welcome to stop by the freight office anytime to clarify any questions you might have about your accounts. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "He knows I've been looking at the records." "Someone talked," Silas said. Not accusatory, just the flat statement of a man recalibrating. "Of course someone talked." She sat down on the step beside him. The sun was going down over the hills, and it was the kind of evening that would have been peaceful if they were different people in a different situation. "It doesn't change anything. It means he's watching. He's been watching since you paid those coins." She set her bag down between her feet. "What else did Deer say?" "He said the roads up here can be difficult in bad weather." Silas's voice was entirely level. "He said he hoped I didn't have any trouble with them." She looked at the hills. "The roads up here were fine. It hadn't rained in 3 weeks." "How many people know you supported what I found?" she asked. "Not what I found, just that you're the one who brought me up here, that you let me use Hector's records." "Everyone who was in that square," he said, "which is everyone in town." She thought about that. "Blackwell wants you to cut me loose," she said. "That's what the message was. He wants you to distance yourself, and then he wants me isolated." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not what's going to happen." She looked at him. "I didn't bring you up here to use you for bookkeeping," he said. He was looking at the hills, not at her, which made it easier to believe he meant it rather than performing it. "I brought you up here because nobody should be standing on a produce crate being sold like a piece of farm equipment. Whatever you're doing with those records..." He paused. Hector worked this land his whole life. He was a careful man. He didn't make mistakes. If he found something wrong and 3 months later he was dead, then... He stopped again. "Then someone ought to find out what he found," Rosalie said. "Yeah." They sat there for a while. The light kept going. She could feel the weight of the copied records in her bag, and the weight of how much further she still had to go, and the strange, specific weight of sitting next to a person who had decided not to leave. "I'm going to need you to help me get to the Pendleton Ranch," she said finally. "Jim Pendleton owes Blackwell on a foreclosure threat. He won't open the door to me alone." "He'll open the door if I'm there," Silas said. "I know." She paused. "You'll be putting yourself further into this. I'm aware. Blackwell doesn't make idle threats. I'm aware of that too." He picked up the coffee cup he'd apparently been holding when Harlan Deer arrived and found it cold. He drank it anyway. "Miss Mercer." "Rosalie." He looked at her then. "Rosalie, I lived up on this hill for 3 years after my uncle left me this place. I kept to myself because it seemed easier and safer, and I'd had enough of people who wanted things from me that I couldn't give them without losing something I needed to keep." He set the cup down. "Hector used to say that there are things you can ignore long enough that they go away, and there are things you can ignore long enough that they get bigger, and the hard part is knowing which is which." She looked at him. "This is the second kind," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She picked up her bag and went inside to start organizing the new records. She worked for 3 hours at the kitchen table by lamplight, and when she finally stopped and rolled her neck and looked at what she'd built, what she saw was the beginning of a picture. Not complete yet, not anywhere near complete, but enough to show the shape of something. A system of theft that had been running for years across an entire valley, invisible because the people suffering from it all thought they were suffering alone. Blackwell had built his empire on separation, on the assumption that no one would compare notes, on the bet that a rancher in one corner of the valley would never sit down with a rancher from another corner and look at their numbers side by side. What he hadn't counted on was a woman who'd been auctioned on a Tuesday morning and had nothing left to lose. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she fell asleep quickly. Not because she felt safe, exactly, but because she had work to do, and the work was real, and in the morning there would be more of it. Outside, the hills were dark and quiet. 8 miles down the road, in the lamplit office of the Blackwell Freight Company, a man with a smooth expression and cold, calculating eyes was looking at a list of names that his man Harlan Deer had brought him that afternoon. He drew a slow line under one of the names at the bottom. Granger. He folded the paper and held it in his hands for a moment, thinking about the particular problem of a woman who understood numbers in a valley full of men who had trusted him precisely because they didn't. Then opened his desk drawer and took out a different piece of paper altogether. The paper Blackwell had taken from his desk drawer that night turned out to be a foreclosure notice. Rosalie didn't know that yet. She found out 4 days later when Jim Pendleton met her and Silas at his front door with the notice in his hand and the expression of a man who had been punched while he was still deciding whether to throw a punch himself. "Got this yesterday," Jim said, holding it out. Silas took it and read it. His face didn't change much, but something around his eyes did. He handed it to Rosalie. The notice claimed that Pendleton owed Blackwell Freight an outstanding balance of $212 in unpaid freight charges, and that if the balance wasn't settled within 30 days, Blackwell would exercise a lien he held on the Pendleton property through a loan instrument signed 18 months prior. Rosalie read it twice. Then she asked Jim Pendleton for his freight records, his loan documents, and every piece of paper related to Blackwell that he had in his house. Jim looked at Silas. "She's better at this than either of us," Silas said simply. Jim Pendleton let her in. She spent 6 hours at that table. What she found was that the $212 balance was constructed from 4 separate billing errors, each one individually small enough to be dismissed as clerical, together amounting to a deliberate fabrication. The loan instrument was real. Jim had signed it, under pressure, during a bad winter when cattle prices collapsed. But the interest calculations applied to it were not what the document specified. Someone had been recalculating the interest at a higher rate and recording the difference as freight charges to obscure it. It was elegant, in the way that dishonest things sometimes are. If you looked at the freight charges alone, they seemed high but possible. If you looked at the loan alone, the balance seemed wrong, but maybe you'd miscounted. If you looked at both together and understood how one was being used to launder the other, the whole construction became visible. Rosalie explained it to Jim Pendleton in the plainest language she could find. Halfway through her explanation, he got up and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window for a moment before he came back and sat down. My wife's been losing sleep over this for 8 months, he said. I know, Rosalie said, because she could see it in the records. The desperate scrambling, the partial payments, the handwritten notes in the margins where someone had been trying to figure out what they were missing. It wasn't your fault. It was designed so you couldn't see it. Blackwell sat at this table, Jim said. He had coffee. He looked at me in the eye. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. What do we do? He asked. First, you don't pay this notice. Don't pay anything else to Blackwell Freight until we're finished. She folded the foreclosure notice and set it aside. Second, I need copies of everything. All of it. And then? And then, she said, we build something he can't erase. The copies were the heart of it. That was what she kept coming back to as she worked through the days that followed, moving between ranches with Silas driving and the increasingly thick sheaf of records growing in the wooden crate that now lived permanently in the back of the wagon. Blackwell could destroy his own ledgers. He could instruct his clerks to alter his records, pressure his bookkeepers, burn whatever he needed to burn. What he couldn't do was reach inside every farmhouse and boarding house and small operation in the valley and eliminate the receipts and invoices that ordinary people had kept in ordinary drawers and boxes and tins on their shelves. Not because they were building a case, but because that was what careful people did. Hector Granger had kept everything. Mabel Finch had kept everything. Tom Harmon's wife, a quiet woman named Bess, had kept 37 months of freight receipts in a biscuit tin on the top shelf of her pantry because she'd never trusted Blackwell's end-of-year statements and had wanted something to compare them against. People kept things, especially people who suspected, on some level they couldn't quite articulate, that something was wrong. Rosalie was beginning to understand that she wasn't uncovering a secret so much as she was assembling the pieces of something that every person in this valley already half knew, but couldn't see as a whole because they'd each only been looking at their own small piece of it. The trick Blackwell had pulled off was not brilliance. It was isolation. Keep everyone separate. Make each person feel alone in their confusion and slightly ashamed of it. Let the shame do the work of silence so he never had to. She thought about that sitting in the wagon one afternoon while Silas navigated the ruts on the road toward the Morrison brothers' place for a second visit. She thought about the produce crate in the town square and the crowd that had laughed in the silence before Silas spoke up. And she thought that Edgar Blackwell hadn't invented that particular mechanism. He'd just been good at using it. You've gone quiet, Silas said. I'm thinking. About the records? About why it worked for so long. She watched the road. People knew something was wrong, not the specifics, but they felt it, and they didn't say anything because they assumed everybody else was fine, and it was just them. That's usually how it goes, he said. It shouldn't be. No, he agreed. It shouldn't. She looked at him. He was watching the road with that habitual steadiness of his, hands easy on the reins, the roan horse picking its way around the worst of the ruts without being asked. She'd been at the ranch for almost 3 weeks now, and she still hadn't entirely figured out Silas Granger. He wasn't simple. She'd dropped that assumption within the first 2 days. But he was also genuinely what he appeared to be, which in her experience was a rarer quality in a person than it should have been. He said what he meant. He didn't want things from her that he hadn't said out loud. She still kept waiting for the bill to come due. She suspected she'd be waiting for a long time. It was Mabel Finch who told her about the meeting. She came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, driving herself in a small buggy with the focused competence of a woman who had been doing things herself for decades and had no intention of stopping. She tied up at the fence post and came to the door, and when Rosalie opened it, Mabel walked straight past her to the kitchen table, as if she'd been coming to this house her whole life. Blackwell's called a creditors' meeting, she said, sitting down. Next Tuesday. At the freight office. All the men who have outstanding balances, which is half the valley, are required to attend or their accounts are considered in default. Rosalie stayed standing. He's accelerating. He's scared, Mabel said. There's a difference. She set her hands flat on the table. People have been talking, not loudly, not in public, but you've been going around to these places. People have been comparing. Word gets back. Word gets back to Blackwell too. Yes. Mabel looked at her steadily. He's going to try to lock everyone down before you finish what you're doing. If he can get them all into that office and get signatures on revised payment agreements, he's got fresh documentation that supersedes the old disputed invoices. Rosalie sat down slowly. It was a smart move. She had to give him that. If he could get even half those ranchers to sign new agreements, the evidentiary value of the original inflated invoices dropped considerably. It wouldn't erase the fraud, but it would muddy it, create enough ambiguity that a territorial court with a sympathetic judge could find reasonable doubt. He needs their signatures, she said. He needs them scared enough to sign without reading carefully. Mabel paused, which most of them will be because most of them are already scared. When did you find out about this? Yesterday. One of his clerks boards with me. A small pause. The young one doesn't know I know what I know. Rosalie looked at her. You've been watching him for a while. I've been watching him since before my husband died, Mabel said. There was no particular emotion in her voice, just fact. I just didn't have anyone who could tell me what I was seeing. The two women looked at each other across the table. I need 5 days, Rosalie said. If I have 5 days, I can have a complete documentation of the freight fraud across every ranch I've visited. Every discrepancy, calculated, sourced, and cross-referenced. Something that doesn't depend on his records at all. Only ours. The meeting is Tuesday. Today is Thursday. Mabel did the arithmetic without being asked. You can't get to every ranch and do the calculations and copy it all in 5 days. Not alone, Rosalie said. She asked Silas that night. Not whether he was willing, she already knew the answer to that. She asked whether he could think of anyone they'd already spoken to who could be trusted with the task of going back to ranches they hadn't yet visited and collecting records on Rosalie's behalf, following the specific list of what to look for that she would write out for them. He thought for a moment. Tom Harmon's oldest son. He's 20, he can read, and he's furious. Who else? Daria Calloway's brother is visiting from up north. He's not local. Blackwell doesn't have anything on him. Anyone else? Morrison brothers can handle the south end of the valley. They don't talk much, but they do what they say they'll do. Rosalie wrote the names down. I need to write out exactly what they're looking for. I can't have them pulling random records. I need freight invoices, delivery confirmations, payment receipts, and any loan documents involving Blackwell as the lender. That's it. Those specific things. I can ride out in the morning, Silas said. I need to come with you to explain it. Then we start at first light. He paused. Rosalie, what happens if we can't get it all done before Tuesday? She was quiet for a moment. Then I go to the meeting. He looked at her. If Blackwell is going to have half the valley in that room, then that's where I need to be, she said. Not to stop him signing things. I can't stop that. But to make sure that everyone in that room knows what they'd be signing and why. He won't let you in. He can't keep me out if I'm already inside when the meeting starts. She met his eyes. Mabel can get me in. The young clerk boards with her. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest, the kind of wind that meant a weather change was coming in off the mountains. He has men, he said, Deer and at least 2 others. If he decides to remove you from that room, then he removes me in front of everyone he's trying to get signatures from, she said. In front of men who've already started to wonder. In front of men who are going to look at how he treats a woman who asks inconvenient questions and draw their own conclusions. Silas looked at her for a long time. That's a significant risk. Yes, she held his gaze. I've had a significant amount of practice with those. He exhaled slowly. First light, he said. We'll do what we can. Well, the 5 days that followed were the most exhausting of her life, which was a statement that covered considerable territory. She slept 3 to 4 hours a night and spent the rest of it working by lamplight, organizing the records that came in from Tom Harmon's son and Daria Calloway's brother and the Morrison brothers who moved through the south end of the valley with a quiet efficiency that she came to deeply respect. What they brought her was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected it to be bad. The Lindqvist family, Swedish immigrants who'd been in the valley 6 years, had been paying freight surcharges that amounted to nearly a quarter of their annual cattle income. They'd chalked it up to being foreigners, to not understanding the system, to the polite but unmistakable implication that they should be grateful the freight company served them at all. Old Clem Burris, who ran a small goat operation on the eastern edge of the valley, was $90 into a Blackwell loan that should have been paid off 14 months ago by his own calculation, and was by Rosalie's calculation, but that Blackwell's office continued to claim was outstanding, with monthly interest accruing on the phantom balance. The Reed family, a widow and her 3 adult children, had accepted a land boundary adjustment 18 months ago that they'd been told was a survey correction, but that Rosalie, looking at the documents, could see was a quiet transfer of 11 acres of their property to a holding company that, she was nearly certain, belonged to Blackwell through an intermediary. That last one was new. That wasn't freight fraud. That was something with a different and uglier shape. She set those documents aside and kept building her central record. She had a system now. She'd built it over the first week at the ranch and refined it every day since. Each fraudulent charge was documented with 3 columns: what Blackwell's records claimed, what the ranch's own records showed, and the difference. At the bottom of each page, she totaled the difference. Then she had a master page where all the ranch totals accumulated. She added the Reed family's freight overpayments and moved their land documents to a separate file. On Sunday night, Silas came in and looked at the table and the organized chaos that had been accumulating across it for days and said nothing for a moment. "Can I see?" he asked. She showed him the master total. He sat down. The number was $11,240 across 23 separate ranching and business operations over 4 years. Silas didn't say anything for a while. "There are at least 6 more operations I haven't gotten to," she said. "The actual number is higher." $11,000, he said, as if repeating it would make it feel more like a real number and less like something from a different world. "And that's only the freight fraud." She pulled out the Reed family's land documents. "I think he's also been executing land transfers." She watched Silas's face as he looked at the documents she placed in front of him, watched the moment it landed. "He's been buying up land," he said slowly, "through someone else. I don't know who yet, but yes. If he gets enough land, he controls the water," she said. "This whole valley runs off 3 creek systems. If he controls the land around the headwaters of those creeks..." She stopped. "The freight operation isn't the main game. It's how he finances the main game." Silas was very still. "Hector figured it out," she said quietly. "Not all of it, but enough." Monday morning, the day before the creditors' meeting, Harlan Deere came up the road. He didn't come alone this time. He came with 2 other men she didn't recognize, both of them with the particular quality of stillness that meant they were being paid to be present and didn't need a specific reason. They stopped their horses at the fence line, and Deere called out to the house. Silas went to the door. Rosalie stayed at the table, but she could hear everything through the open window. "Mr. Blackwell wants a word with Miss Mercer," Deere said pleasantly. "Wants to clear up some misunderstandings before tomorrow's meeting. Miss Mercer's welcome to come down to the office at her convenience today." "She's busy," Silas said. "Mr. Blackwell would consider it a personal favor." "Then Mr. Blackwell can come up here and ask her himself." A pause. "That's not how Mr. Blackwell generally..." "I know how he generally does things," Silas said. "I'm telling you how it is." Another pause, longer this time. Then Deere said, "Mr. Blackwell's also asked me to let you know that there's a supply of fencing materials at his warehouse that he believes belongs to you. He's happy to release them at any time, once the current situation is resolved." Rosalie's jaw tightened. He was holding supplies. She didn't know when Silas had ordered them or how Blackwell had managed to intercept them, but it didn't matter. It was the message that mattered. "I can reach your operation. I can slow you down. I can make your ranch harder to run while you spend your time poking at my business." "Tell him I appreciate the concern," Silas said, in a tone that meant something quite different. The men rode back down. Silas came inside and looked at her. "He's applying pressure." "I know." She looked at the master documentation she'd spent 5 days building. "He's going to apply more." "Are you ready for tomorrow?" She thought about what tomorrow meant. She thought about walking into a room full of frightened men, and a man who had spent years making sure he was the most powerful person in any room he entered. She thought about the speech she'd been composing in her head for 3 days. Not a speech, exactly, but the truth, laid out plainly, in language that didn't require a head for numbers to understand. She thought about standing on a produce crate while people laughed. "I've been getting ready for tomorrow my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know what it was going to look like." Silas nodded, slow and certain, the way he nodded when something settled inside him and he was done deliberating about it. "Then we go." The Blackwell Freight office was on the main street of Iron Bluff, between the bank and the hardware store. It was the largest commercial building on the street, 2 stories, recently painted, with the company name in large letters above the door. Blackwell had built it 6 years ago, and it had always struck people as slightly too large for what the town required, which was, Rosalie now understood, the point. It was a declaration, a monument to the certainty that he would always need more space. She and Silas arrived an hour before the meeting was scheduled to start. Mabel Finch had been true to her word. The young clerk had left the side door unlatched at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived, moved by some combination of his own uneasy conscience and the influence of the woman he boarded with, who had spent Sunday evening being very persuasively quiet about certain things. The main room was set up with chairs facing a raised desk. The same staging logic as the auction, she noted, and felt the observation land somewhere uncomfortable. Silas stood near the back wall. Rosalie sat in the second row and put her bag on the floor and her hands in her lap and waited. The ranchers came in over the next 45 minutes. Some of them she knew well by now. Tom Harmon, who nodded at her with a tightness around his mouth that meant he was holding something down. Jim Pendleton, who looked like he hadn't slept. Daria Calloway came, which surprised her. Daria had no outstanding balance anymore, technically, but she'd come anyway, which meant she'd come on purpose. The Morrison brothers appeared in the doorway and took positions near the wall on the opposite side from Silas, flanking the room like men who had discussed their positions in advance. Others came in who hadn't heard what Rosalie had found, who were still in the original state of isolated confusion and shame and debt. She could identify them by the way they held their hats. Blackwell came in at precisely the scheduled time. He saw her immediately. She was not difficult to spot, being a woman in a room otherwise full of men, and his expression did what it always did, processed, smoothed, and arrived at pleasant. He walked to the raised desk and put his hands on it and looked out at the assembled room. "Appreciate everyone coming," he said warmly. "I know it's a busy time of year. I'll try to make this brief." He began to speak about the economic difficulties of the current season and his concern, as a businessman rooted in this community, for the sustainability of the valley's operations. His voice was practiced and reasonable. He talked about the freight business as a service he provided, a service that required ongoing investment and carried real costs, a service he'd provided for years in good faith to every man in this room. He was very good at it. She had to acknowledge that. He was very good at making dishonesty sound like neighborliness. He'd been speaking for about 10 minutes when he placed a stack of documents on the desk and said, "I've drawn up some restructured agreements that I think will give everyone more breathing room." "I have a question," Rosalie said. The room went quiet in the particular way that happens when a woman speaks in a setting where she was not expected to. Blackwell looked at her, the smile held. "Miss Mercer, I didn't realize you had an outstanding account with us." "I don't," she said. "I have questions about the outstanding accounts of the people in this room. This meeting is for, I know what this meeting is for." She stood up. She'd decided to stand. Sitting made her feel like she was still on the produce crate, and she was done with that particular feeling. It's to get signatures on documents before the men in this room find out that the balances on those documents are fabricated. The silence was different now. Blackwell's smile stayed where it was, but something behind his eyes went cold and absolutely still. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes," she said. "It is." She reached into her bag and produced the documentation. Not all of it. All of it was back at the ranch, secured. What she had was a clean summary sheet for each of the ranches represented in this room, and her master total sheet, and the core of Hector Granger's original notebook with its final 3-word entry. She held them up. "Over the past 3 weeks," she said, clearly, not loud, but clearly, "I have reviewed freight records from 23 operations in this valley. I have compared those records against the invoices and billing statements issued by Blackwell Freight. The average discrepancy per operation over 4 years is $489. She let that land. "The total overcharge across all 23 operations is $11,240. The room made a sound. Not words, just a collective exhale. The sound of people receiving information that confirms the thing they half knew and hoped wasn't true. Blackwell said, "I don't know where you're getting these numbers." "From the ranchers themselves," she said, "from the receipts and invoices in their own homes. None of it comes from your records. None of it requires trusting your records. It requires trusting your customers' records, which they've kept." A hand went up in the third row. "Tom Harmon." The number she's saying, Tom said, directing this at the room rather than at anyone specific. She showed it to me at my own table, went through every receipt, it checks out. Another voice. Jim Pendleton. Same at my place. Blackwell's voice sharpened. I would advise everyone in this room. What those documents are, Rosalie said, gesturing at the stack on the raised desk, is a way to make the fraud harder to prove by replacing the original disputed invoices with new agreements you'll sign without reading carefully because you're afraid. She looked around the room. Not at Blackwell. At the men with their hats. You're not bad at math. You're not confused. You've been cheated systematically for years. And you know that because you felt it, and you've been ashamed of feeling it because you thought you were alone. The room was very, very quiet. Harlan Deere appeared in the doorway to the back office, and two other men materialized behind him with the studied casualness of men waiting to be told to do something. Blackwell looked at Rosalie with an expression she'd never seen on him before. The smoothness was still there, but underneath it something was exposed. Not fear, not quite. The particular look of a man who has built his life on a specific kind of control, discovering that the control has slipped somewhere he didn't notice. Miss Mercer, he said, quietly now, dangerously quiet. You would be wise to consider very carefully what you're doing. She looked at him. She thought about the produce crate. She thought about Hector Granger's notebook. She thought about Bess Harmon's biscuit tin and Daria Calloway's sleepless months and the Lindqvist family, who'd apologized for not understanding the system that had been purposely built to be incomprehensible to them. Mr. Blackwell, she said, in the same clear and ordinary voice she'd been using all morning, no person in this room belongs to you. Not their land, not their labor, and not their silence. She set the summary sheets on the empty chair beside her. Don't sign anything today, she said to the room. Take those documents home. Have someone read them carefully, and then come find me, because I have something better for you to sign. A joint statement of claim, addressed to the Federal Land and Commerce Office, with enough documentation attached to it that even a bought judge can't make it disappear. Blackwell said something sharp to Deere. Rosalie was already picking up her bag. Silas was at her side before she reached the door, and when they came out into the morning light of Iron Bluff's main street, she heard the sound of chairs moving inside. Not one chair, but many, the sound of people standing up all at the same time. She kept walking. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until the cold air hit them. You all right? Silas said quietly beside her. I'm fine, she said. Then, I'm not entirely fine. I know. He matched her pace. You did it anyway. Yeah, she said. I did. Behind them, through the wall of the Blackwell Freight office, she heard raised voices. Not angry, exactly, or not only angry. The sound of people talking to each other about something they'd been keeping to themselves for a very long time, suddenly finding that they all had the same thing to say. She thought about what came next. The joint statement, the federal office, the distance between where they were and the kind of authority that could actually move against a man like Edgar Blackwell. It was still a long road with real dangers on it, and she was under no illusions about how dangerous the next stretch was going to be. But the silence was broken. In a room full of people who'd been separated by shame and isolation, the silence was broken. And no matter what Blackwell did with the time he had left, he couldn't put that back together again. She and Silas reached the wagon. She climbed up without waiting for help. Above the roofline of Iron Bluff, the sky was the same pale gold as the hills she'd been looking at through the ranch kitchen window all these weeks, and somewhere in that sky, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time was beginning, slowly, to loosen. The shaking in her hands was gone by the time they reached the edge of town. She noticed that, the way you notice small physical facts when your mind is still running too fast to settle on any one thing. Gone by the edge of town, and what replaced it was not calm exactly, but something more functional. The particular focus that comes after you've done the thing you were most afraid to do and found out you could survive it. What she was less certain about was what came next. Silas drove without speaking for the first mile, which she appreciated. She needed the space to think, and he seemed to understand that without being told, which was one of the things about him she'd stopped being surprised by and started simply relying on. He's going to move fast, she said, when the silence had done what it needed to do. How fast? Before we can get the joint statement to the federal office. That's his window between today and whenever federal marshals could realistically respond. She watched the road. He'll try to destroy records first, the freight ledgers, the loan documents, anything that corroborates what I've shown. His copies, the originals. He can't get to our copies. No, but he doesn't know that yet, and when he figures it out, she stopped. He'll try to discredit me, personally. He'll make it about who I am instead of what I found. Silas's jaw moved slightly. He'll bring up the auction. He'll make it worse than the auction. He'll say I have a vendetta, that I'm a woman with a grudge and no standing, and the numbers are invented. She'd been thinking about this since the moment she'd walked into that meeting room, which is why the joint statement has to be signed by the ranchers themselves. Their names, not mine. I'm the one who found it, but they're the ones it happened to. Their testimony is what matters to federal investigators. How quickly can you get the statement written? I can have a draft by tonight. She'd been composing it in her head for 3 days, adjusting it as the evidence accumulated. But I need signatures before Blackwell has a chance to visit each of them privately and remind them of what he holds over their operations. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then, I can ride tonight. Start with Harmon, then Pendleton. You write it, I'll get it signed. She looked at him. That's a full night's riding. I've done worse. She believed him. There was something in the way he said it. Not self-pity, not boasting, just the plain accounting of a man who had done difficult things and continued doing them because they needed doing. She'd learned enough of his history in pieces over the past weeks to understand that the ranch hadn't come easily, that the years before it hadn't been easy either, that what looked like solitary stubbornness from the outside was actually something more considered and harder earned. All right, she said. Tonight then. She wrote the joint statement in 3 hours, working at the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and the coffee she'd made went cold beside her. It was 4 pages. She'd wanted it shorter, but there were specific legal requirements for the kind of claim they were making to a federal commerce office. And she knew enough about those requirements to know that leaving things out was more dangerous than including them. The statement laid out, in factual and sequential language, the nature of the overcharging scheme, how it operated, over what period, across which operations, with what total financial effect. It cited the documentation they held by ranch and by type. It named Edgar Blackwell by name and Blackwell Freight by full registered business name. It included a separate section on the land transfer documents involving the Reed family, flagged as potentially related but requiring independent investigation. The last paragraph was the one she'd thought hardest about. It was a formal request for federal investigation and a request that the investigating body operate from outside the territorial jurisdiction of Iron Bluffs County, given the documented conflict of interest represented by local law enforcement's relationship with the subject of the investigation. She didn't say Blackwell owned the sheriff. She let the documented facts create that implication on their own. When she finished, she read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slower, looking for anything that could be twisted or dismissed or used against them. She found 2 phrases she didn't like and rewrote them until they were plain enough that they couldn't be misread by accident or by intention. Then she made a full copy, by hand, longhand, every word, because she had learned in the past weeks that you kept copies of everything and you kept them somewhere separate from the original. Silas left at dusk with the original statement folded carefully in his coat pocket and a list of the rancher's locations in order of priority. She watched him go from the front step and then went inside and did not let herself think about the various things that could go wrong between now and morning. Instead, she went back to the Reed family's land documents and worked on reconstructing the chain of transfers that had moved 11 acres of their property into a holding company. The holding company was registered under a name she didn't recognize, Clearwater Land Trust, but the registration documents, which she'd obtained by writing to the Territorial Records Office 3 weeks ago under the pretext of a general inquiry, showed a registered agent whose name was familiar, Henry Voss. She'd heard that name once, in passing, in a conversation between Tom Harmon and his son that she hadn't been meant to hear. Something about the Territorial Land Commissioner, something about a ruling that had gone the wrong way. She wrote the name down and circled it and sat back and looked at what she was looking at. If Blackwell had a partner in the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, that changed the scope of what they were dealing with. It meant the fraud wasn't just a local operation run by a clever businessman. It meant there was a government official who had been manipulating land titles across the frontier, not just in this valley, but potentially everywhere that official's jurisdiction reached. It meant that getting federal marshals to respond wasn't just important for Iron Bluff. It was important for every valley like this one. She stayed up until 2 in the morning working through the land transfer records, cross-referencing what she had against the territorial records she'd obtained. By the time she stopped, she had what she believed was a documented connection between Clearwater Land Trust, Edgar Blackwell, and Henry Voss of the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office. She put it all in a separate folder and wrote on the front of it in clear letters, Voss, separate investigation, do not include in primary statement. Then she went to bed because she was human and she needed to sleep, and the work would still be there in the morning. Silas came back at dawn with 17 signatures. He looked like a man who had ridden through the night, which he had, coat dusty, jaw set, with the particular exhaustion that sits behind the eyes. And he put the signed statement on the kitchen table and sat down in the chair beside it, and rubbed his face with both hands. Morrison Brothers took some convincing, he said. What got them? I showed them the total. He paused. The younger one did the math on his own share. Then he said he'd sign. Rosalie poured him coffee and set it in front of him and looked at the signatures. 17. There were 3 more operations she'd visited that weren't on the list. The Lindqvist family, old Clem Burris, and a smaller operation run by a young couple named Garrett, who were new enough to the valley to be frightened of everything. I'll get the rest today, she said. On my own. He looked up at her. You need to sleep, she said. A few hours at least. And I need you functional when this escalates, which it will. He didn't argue, which told her how tired he actually was. He drank the coffee and went to the spare room that she'd been occupying because it was closer, and she heard the springs settle, and then nothing. She took the wagon herself. She'd been driving since she was 14, and her father was too drunk to manage the reins, and the roan horse was by now accustomed enough to her that there was no negotiation required. The Lindqvist signed without hesitation. Eric Lindqvist had apparently been at the creditors' meeting the day before. She hadn't seen him, but the room had been crowded. And he'd gone home and explained to his wife what had happened, and she'd said something in Swedish that he declined to translate, but that was clearly decisive. Clem Burris, 81 years old and living alone on a property that was too large for one man and that he refused to reduce because his wife had planted the kitchen garden in 1861. And he saw no reason to give any of it up, met her at the gate with a shotgun, and then recognized her and put it down and said, figured someone would come eventually, and signed the statement with a hand that shook slightly but wrote his name clearly. The Garrett couple took the most time. They were in their late 20s, with a 2-year-old who kept interrupting the conversation by requiring things, and they were afraid in a specific and reasonable way, afraid of retaliation, afraid of being wrong, afraid of choosing the wrong side and losing the little they'd managed to build. Rosalie sat at their table for 2 hours. She didn't rush them. She answered every question they asked, and some of them were questions she'd been asking herself for weeks, and she answered those as honestly as she could, which meant acknowledging that she didn't know exactly how this would resolve or exactly how long it would take. What I know, she said, is that if nobody signs, nothing changes. He keeps the money he took. He takes more. And someday it won't be a foreclosure notice. It'll be something you can't come back from. The young wife looked at the statement for a long time. Then she picked up the pen. 20 signatures. She got back to the ranch at mid-afternoon to find Silas awake and standing in the yard talking to a man she didn't recognize. Her hand tightened on the reins before she registered that the conversation didn't have the posture of a threat. The stranger was standing easy, hat in his hands, with the manner of someone delivering information rather than enforcing anything. She pulled up and climbed down. "This is Frank Reardon," Silas said. "He rides for the Morrison brothers." The man nodded at her. He was maybe 40, weathered in the way that outdoor work creates, with an honest face and the particular directness of someone who doesn't waste time on performance. "Ma'am, the brothers sent me up to let you know. Blackwell's freight office had a fire last night." She went still. "Small fire," Reardon said, "contained to the records room in the back. Nobody hurt, but the brothers have a boy who does errands around that building, and he says the fire started about 2 hours after everyone left for the night, and it started in the room where the ledgers are kept." Rosalie and Silas looked at each other. "When did it happen?" she asked. "Late last night. Fire was out by midnight." Reardon turned his hat in his hands. There's also word that Blackwell's been calling in some loans. Not the big ones, the small ones, the ones where the people don't have the resources to fight back, moving fast on them. He's cleaning house, Silas said. He's panicking, Rosalie said. But she said it soberly, because a panicking man with power and hired muscle and a cooperative sheriff was not a less dangerous man. He was a differently dangerous one. One more thing, Reardon said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. This came to the Morrison place this morning by messenger, addressed to you, Miss Mercer. She took it and opened it. It was a single line in handwriting she didn't recognize but didn't need to. Bring the woman to my office by end of week, or I foreclose on Granger's North 40. No signature, none was needed. She folded it and put it in her pocket. Thank the Morrison brothers, she said to Reardon. Tell them to secure their own records somewhere off their property, tonight if they can. Reardon nodded and left. She stood in the yard for a moment. The note was in her pocket and she could feel the weight of it, even though it weighed nothing. Blackwell was coming at Silas now because he'd run the calculation and decided it was the faster pressure point. He wasn't entirely wrong about the calculation. What he was wrong about was Silas. She went inside. Silas followed. The North 40, she said. I heard. Does he actually have a lien on it? Silas's expression was careful. There's a loan from 3 years ago when I was getting the ranch back on its feet after I inherited it. I borrowed against that parcel because it was the piece with the least on it. He paused. I've kept the payments current. He'll say you haven't. Yes. He's burned his ledgers, which means the loan terms he claims will be whatever he says they are, and the records that could contradict him are gone. Silas looked at the table full of documentation. Except that I kept my payment receipts. She looked at him. You kept every receipt? Every one. In a box in the cellar. A small, dry pause. My uncle taught me to keep everything. Something loosened in her chest. Get them, she said. Tonight. All of them. We're adding them to the master file. She sat down and pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began writing a letter. Not to the Federal Commerce Office. That was already prepared. To the Federal Marshal's District Office in the Territory Capital with a summary of the fraud documentation, the land transfer evidence, and the name Henry Voss attached to a clear explanation of what she believed his role to be. She'd been holding the Voss information back, unsure whether to include it in the primary statement or treat it as a separate matter. The fire at the freight office made the decision for her. If Blackwell was willing to burn his own records, he was moving toward a clean escape, and a man with a partner in the Territorial Land Commissioner's office had options for escape that went well beyond Iron Bluff. She needed the federal marshals to know about Voss before Voss could bury anything from his end. She wrote for 2 hours. The letter was long and specific, and she backed every claim with a reference to a specific document in her master file. She wrote a covering index that cataloged every piece of evidence they held, what it proved, and where it could be found. Then she wrote a second copy. Then she addressed the original to the federal marshal's office and the copy to a federal circuit judge whose name she'd found in the territorial registry, someone outside the local power structure entirely. I need someone to take these, she said when Silas came back up from the cellar with a box of receipts. Tonight, someone who can get on a fast horse and ride to the capital without stopping in Iron Bluff. Reardon, he said immediately, the Morrison brothers man. He's reliable and he has no connection to Blackwell. Can you get a message to him before dark? Silas was already reaching for his coat. The next 3 days were the longest of her life, which was competing against some significant entries for that title. Blackwell's men rode past the ranch twice a day. Not stopping, just riding past, slow enough to be seen. It was the kind of intimidation that didn't require action to work. It only required you to know you were being watched. She made herself not watch back, or rather she watched matter-of-factly, the way you watch weather, noting it, accounting for it, not letting it determine your next move. Blackwell moved on Clem Burris's property, issuing a foreclosure notice on an alleged unpaid balance that Burris, at 81, didn't have the physical energy to fight. He moved on a small property belonging to a family named Dunmore, who'd signed the joint statement, sending Harlan Deer out with papers before the ink on their signature was dry. It was a message. You signed. Here's the consequence. Tom Harmon came up to the ranch on the second morning with the rigid posture of a man holding himself together through will. Deer came last night, he said. Said Blackwell's prepared to forgive the entire dispute if I withdraw my signature from the statement and sign the revised freight agreement. Rosalie looked at him. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think about it. He sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, which I have been doing, all night. He was quiet for a moment. My wife thinks I should withdraw. She's frightened, Rosalie said. She's practical, he said, with a complicated kind of loyalty in it. She's right that we can't survive a foreclosure. She's right that Blackwell has the sheriff, and probably the judge, and the resources to drag this out for years. He looked at his hands. She's not wrong about any of that. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, No, she's not wrong. He looked up at her, maybe expecting something more, an argument, a persuasion, a reason to stay. She gave him something different. If you withdraw, I understand it, she said. You have a family, a working operation. This is a real risk, and nobody's guaranteeing the outcome. She held his gaze. But I want you to know what we have, before you decide. She walked him through the full documentation for the first time, not just his ranch's piece of it, but the entire constructed picture. The master total, the land transfer evidence, the letter that was currently in Frank Reardon's saddlebag heading for the territory capital, the name Henry Voss and what it meant. She watched his face as it changed. You sent a letter about a territorial official, he said slowly. Yes. If that's wrong, it's not wrong. I have the registration documents. The connection is there. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't try to fill it. My son wants to keep his name on the statement, Tom Harmon said finally. He told me that this morning before I left. He said if I was going to pull mine, he'd sign his separately. He paused. He's 20. He doesn't have a family yet. No, she said. His name means something different than mine does. Yes. She waited. Tom Harmon sat there for another minute. Then he said, How long until the marshals could realistically arrive, if they're going to come at all? Reardon rode 2 nights ago. If he made good time, the letter arrived yesterday. If the marshal's office moves on it immediately, which they may, given the federal commerce angle and the name of a territorial official, we're looking at a week, maybe less. A week is a long time, I know. He looked at the documentation on the table. He looked at his own name on the master list. He picked up his hat. I'm not withdrawing, he said. Tell my wife I said it's because it's the right thing. She knows I'm stubborn enough to do the wrong thing for the right reason, so she'll know I mean it if I say it's the other way around. He left. She sat back down and let out a breath she'd been holding for most of that conversation. On the 4th day, something changed in the town. She didn't see it directly. She heard it from Mabel Finch, who arrived at the ranch in her buggy on Thursday afternoon with news delivered in the economical style of a woman who considers unnecessary words to be an inefficiency. Blackwell hit the Dunmore place this morning, she said. Move them off. Sheriff Dillman stood there and watched. She sat down. But here's the thing. When the Dunmores came into town with their wagon, people helped them. Not one person, not a few. I mean, half the street came out. The Millers gave them space in their barn. Mrs. Holt from the dress shop brought food. She paused. It's not the same town it was 3 weeks ago. Rosalie thought about what she'd said in the freight office meeting, that no person belongs to another, that nobody should have to carry this alone. She hadn't known, when she said it, whether it would mean anything. Words in a room can sound true and still not travel. These had traveled. There's more, Mabel said. Blackwell sent Deer to my boarding house yesterday afternoon. Told me my lease on the building, I lease from a property company that I have now confirmed is another one of his holding entities, is under review due to alleged violations of the rental agreement. She was very composed about this. I've been in that building for 19 years. There are no violations. He's coming after people who helped me, Rosalie said. Yes. Mabel folded her hands on the table. What do you need from me? Rosalie looked at her. This woman, who had been quietly furious since before Rosalie arrived in Iron Bluff, who had kept her records in perfect order for 19 years in a building she now might lose because of it. Your freight records are already in the master file, Rosalie said. The building lease documents. Can you get copies? I have copies. I've always kept copies. Add them to the statement as an appendix. Evidence of retaliatory action against a signatory. Mabel nodded. And Mabel. She waited until the older woman met her eyes. This is going to get worse before it gets better. You know that. I've been watching it get worse for years, Mabel said simply. At least now it's getting worse in the direction of something. The federal marshals arrived on a Friday, which nobody had predicted and everybody had hoped for. There were 4 of them. They came into Iron Bluff from the North Road in the late morning, which meant they'd ridden through the night from wherever they'd staged after receiving the letter. They went to Sheriff Dillman's office first, not to coordinate with him, but to inform him, in terms that left no interpretive flexibility, that his jurisdiction in this matter was suspended pending federal review. Dillman apparently said very little. Rosalie heard this later from the young clerk who boarded with Mabel, who heard it from someone who'd been passing the sheriff's office at the relevant time. She pieced it together the way she pieced most things together. From fragments, from what people remembered, from the spaces between what they told her. What she knew directly was that the lead marshal, a spare, gray-haired man named Aldous Webb, appeared at the ranch at 2 in the afternoon and introduced himself with the brevity of someone who has a lot to do and limited daylight. "You're Rosalie Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "You compiled the documentation sent to our office." "Yes." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "It was good work," he said. Not warmly, professionally, the way one craftsperson might acknowledge another's output. Comprehensive, clear, the Voss connection was unexpected. "Is he? We've been in contact with the Federal Circuit Court. Voss is being looked at independently. That's not your concern right now." He produced a document. "I need to see the originals. Everything referenced in the index." She showed him everything. I went through it methodically, with one of his men taking notes beside him, and he asked specific and intelligent questions, and she answered them precisely. And when he found one entry that she hadn't cross-referenced as thoroughly as she should have, he pointed it out and she acknowledged it and explained why she believed it was still valid, and he accepted the explanation without drama. It took 3 hours. When they were done, Webb stood and put his hat back on. "We're moving on the freight office and Blackwell's private residence this afternoon," he said. "Is there anything in the freight office that's not already destroyed?" "The records room burned 4 nights ago," she said. "Whether anything survived, I don't know. But there's a secondary ledger room on the upper floor that I don't believe he knew I knew about." She paused. "Hector Granger's notebook mentions it. He used to do business at that office, and he made a note about waiting in an upstairs room once while Blackwell conducted another meeting." Webb looked at her. "Second floor, east side," she said. "There may be nothing, but he may not have thought to burn what he thought was hidden." Webb said, "Thank you," and left. Silas had been in the barn during the marshal's visit, doing what the ranch required, and he came in after Webb's wagon disappeared down the road and found her sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "How did it go?" he asked. "He took the documentation." She looked up. "They're moving on Blackwell today." Silas sat down across from her. "There's a secondary ledger room," she said. "I told Webb about it. If there's anything up there." "You found everything there was to find," he said. "Whatever's in that room either helps or it doesn't. You've done what you could do." She knew he was right. She also knew that the particular anxiety of having done everything you could do and still not knowing the outcome was its own distinct kind of misery, and that knowing it was right didn't fully alleviate it. She sat there for a while. Silas didn't leave. He found something to occupy himself with at the counter. Not busy work, exactly, but the low-level maintenance of a working kitchen, the kind of task that can be done without thinking and therefore leaves room for thinking about something else. She'd noticed he did this, found ways to be present that didn't demand anything from the room. "He's going to try something before they reach him," she said. "Probably. He has too much to lose to just let them walk in." Webb seemed like someone who'd anticipated that, Silas said. She thought about Webb's steady gray eyes and his methodical questions and the particular quality he had of being very hard to surprise. She thought he probably had anticipated it. She was right. What she didn't anticipate was that Blackwell's move wouldn't be toward the marshals. It would be toward her. Harlan Deere and 2 men arrived at the ranch at 4 in the afternoon, 1 hour after Webb had left. And she would understand later, approximately 30 minutes after Blackwell had been informed that federal marshals were heading to his office. Deer came to the door with the expression of a man who has been given an instruction he finds distasteful, but will carry out anyway because that is the nature of his employment. Mr. Blackwell requires Miss Mercer to accompany us, he said. Silas was at the door. Behind him in the kitchen, Rosalie heard the words and felt a cold, clear anger that was entirely different from fear. She's not going anywhere with you, Silas said. Mr. Blackwell believes she has documentation that belongs to him. And belongs to him, Silas said flatly. The records were generated by his business operations. The records were generated by the people he cheated, Silas said. And you know that. You've known it for a while. Something moved across Deer's face, not quite guilt, but something adjacent. He recovered it quickly. I have instructions. Harlan. Silas's voice was even. Federal marshals are at Blackwell's office right now. You know that too, or you wouldn't be up here on a Friday afternoon. Whatever he's paying you, it's about to be worth considerably less. A pause. Go home. The silence lasted several seconds. One of the two men behind Deer shifted his weight. Deer looked at Silas and then, briefly, passed him at Rosalie, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the master documentation folder under her arm and an expression that did not suggest she intended to accompany anyone anywhere. Deer turned his horse around. The two men followed him. Rosalie watched them go down the road and felt the anger slowly downgrade into something more like exhaustion, the kind that comes when you've been tensed against something for so long that the easing of it is almost uncomfortable. That could have gone differently, she said. Yes, Silas said. He was still watching the road. You knew he might back down. I thought there was a reasonable chance. He turned. He's a hired man. Hired men calculate odds. She looked at the documentation folder under her arm. $11,000. 23 operations. Henry Voss. A secondary ledger room on the east side of a building currently being searched by federal marshals. She thought about Hector Granger, who had figured out enough to write "This isn't right" in a notebook and had been dead within 3 months. She thought about whether he'd been afraid. She thought he probably had been and had kept going anyway and then run out of time. She didn't know what to do with that except to not run out of time herself. Webb said it was good work, she told Silas. He looked at her. It was. He said it like a fact, not a compliment. Some things are both, Silas said. She went back inside and put the folder on the table and sat down and thought about what they would learn tomorrow. Outside, the sun was doing what it did every evening over those hills, going gold and slow. And somewhere in Iron Bluff, in a 2-story building with a records room that had burned and a secondary ledger room on the east side that hadn't, 4 federal marshals were finding out exactly what Edgar Blackwell had believed was hidden well enough to stay hidden. It wasn't. She knew that in the way she knew figures, not because she wanted it to be true, but because the evidence, laid end to end, pointed only one direction. Whatever was in that room, it had been kept because it was needed, and things kept because they're needed. Don't get destroyed even when destruction seems like the safer option, because the man who needs them is also the man who can't quite believe he'll ever need to use them. Blackwell was that man. She'd understood that about him from the first night she'd spent at the kitchen table, reading Hector's final entry. He was a man who had always believed he would win, and men who believe they will always win keep records of their winning. She put her head down on her arms on the kitchen table, just for a moment, just for the brief luxury of not holding herself upright under the weight of what she'd been carrying. She was still there, half asleep in the lamplight, when Silas came in an hour later and quietly put a blanket over her shoulders and let her rest. She woke with her cheek pressed against the kitchen table and a blanket around her shoulders that she didn't remember putting there. The lamp had burned low. Outside the window, it was fully dark. The deep, still dark of a rural night somewhere past midnight. Her neck ached from the angle. The documentation folder was still under her right arm, which had gone numb, and she shifted and felt the pins and needles start and let them, because that particular discomfort meant she'd actually slept, which was something her body had needed badly enough to override everything else. The blanket smelled like the cedar chest in the spare room. She sat up and folded it and put it on the chair and sat there for a few minutes in the near dark, just existing, which was something she hadn't had much practice at lately. Existing without calculating, without anticipating the next move. without the documentation folder and the freight records and the name Henry Voss arranging themselves into patterns behind her eyes. It didn't last long. Her mind wasn't built for extended stillness. But those few minutes were real, and she noticed them and filed them under things she intended to do more of when this was over. She went to bed properly, in the spare room, and slept until the birds started. And when she came out in the morning, Silas was already at the stove, and there was coffee, and the eggs were, again, slightly overcooked, and she sat down and ate them without comment and felt, in some complicated and not entirely comfortable way, at home. Marshal Webb came back at 9 in the morning, and this time he stayed for 2 hours. He sat at the kitchen table where the documentation had lived for weeks, and put his own folder on it and went through what they'd found in the secondary ledger room on the east side of the Blackwell Freight building. His voice had the same quality it had had the day before, flat, informational, without theater, and she appreciated that about him because she was tired of things that required a particular kind of emotional readiness, and she didn't have that readiness right now. The secondary ledger room had been intact. Blackwell had not burned it, either because he'd calculated the risk and decided it was lower than the freight records room, or because, as she'd suspected, he'd believed it was hidden well enough. Whatever the reason, what the marshals found there was, in Webb's words, extensive. 12 years of records, Webb said. The freight operation goes back further than your documentation. You had 4 years. He's been running this particular scheme for at least a decade, possibly longer, in stages. What you found was the most recent and most aggressive phase. She absorbed that. Other valleys? He had operations in 2 other counties that appear to follow a similar model. We're still working through the scope of it. Webb paused. The Clearwater Land Trust connection to Voss is confirmed. Voss has been in federal custody since yesterday evening. She set her coffee down. He was taken in the Capitol, Webb said. Apparently he attempted to remove certain files from the Land Commissioner's office when he was informed that federal investigators wanted to speak with him. The attempt to remove the files was itself useful to us. He panicked, Silas said. Men in his position often do, Webb said, without satisfaction. Just fact. They've spent years believing they're untouchable. When the belief turns out to be wrong, the response is rarely dignified. Rosalie thought about Blackwell standing at the raised desk in the freight office meeting room, his expression smooth and controlled and absolutely certain. She thought about what that certainty must have felt like from the inside, the deep, practiced comfort of a man who had never genuinely lost. "Where's Blackwell?" she asked. "In federal custody as of last night." Webb looked at her steadily. He attempted to leave on the evening stage, with a considerable amount of cash and what appeared to be a prepared set of identity documents. She thought, of course he did. Of course he had that ready. Men like Blackwell always had something ready. "He didn't make it," she said. "No," Webb said. "He didn't." The legal process that followed was neither quick nor clean, which was something nobody told you about justice when you were in the middle of fighting for it. You imagined it as a resolution, a door closing, a line drawn, a clear before and after. What it actually was paperwork and delay, and the slow grinding movement of federal process across hundreds of documents and 2 county jurisdictions and a territorial commissioner's office that had to be restructured from the ground up because the man who'd been running it had been running it in Blackwell's interest for 11 years. Webb remained in Iron Bluff for 3 weeks, working out of a temporary federal office he set up in the back of Mabel Finch's boarding house, which Mabel made available with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this purpose. He interviewed ranchers. He interviewed clerks. He interviewed Harlan Deere, who had, it turned out, kept his own notes about certain instructions he'd received over the years. Notes he'd kept, Rosalie suspected, for exactly the reason she kept things. Because you never knew when the balance of power might shift, and you'd need something to show. Deere's cooperation was complicated, and she didn't spend too much time thinking about the moral geometry of it. He'd done things that had hurt people. He'd also given Webb information that filled in gaps she couldn't fill from the documentation alone. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she left them to be true without trying to resolve them into something simpler. The foreclosure notices were suspended within the first week by federal order. Clem Burris got his property back. The Dunmores, who'd been in the miller's barn, moved back into their house on a Thursday, and she heard later that when they pulled up in their wagon, half the street came out again, same as when they'd left, because Iron Bluff was learning something about itself that it hadn't known before, that it was capable of that, of showing up, of being the kind of place where people came out of their houses when a neighbor needed something. It was a small thing, maybe, but it wasn't nothing. The fraudulent foreclosures were formally overturned 6 weeks after Blackwell's arrest. Every affected property was returned to its owners. The financial restitution process was slower. It involved a court-appointed receiver going through the Blackwell operation's assets and calculating what could be recovered and distributed, but Webb told her in one of his brief and factual updates that he expected most families to receive at least a partial recovery of what they'd been overcharged. Not all of it, he said. No, she said, but some. Some is better than none. Yes, she said. It is. Silas's North 40 was never touched. The loan documents, cross-referenced against his payment receipts from the seller, showed he'd been current within 10 days of every due date for 3 years. The loan itself was legitimate. Unlike some of the others, Blackwell had apparently decided that manufacturing a default would require too much visible manipulation on a debt where the documentation was too clean. The lien threat had been exactly what she'd thought it was: pressure, not substance. She put the payment receipts back in their box and the box back in the cellar because Silas Granger was a man who kept everything, and there was no reason to stop now. Clement Mercer came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in the 5th week, which was not something she'd anticipated and not something she'd prepared herself for, which meant that when she saw his wagon coming up the road, she had about 3 minutes to figure out how she felt about it before she had to decide what to do with the feeling. She felt, in those 3 minutes, a considerable number of things. Anger, which was familiar and well-worn and not particularly useful at this point. Grief, which surprised her slightly, because what she was grieving wasn't anything she'd had recently, but the version of a father she'd constructed in her imagination at 10 or 11 years old, before she'd understood clearly what he was. Exhaustion, which was not specifically about him, but was about the general accumulation of everything. And something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. A kind of weary, complicated readiness. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and maybe not ever in the full sense. But the recognition that she couldn't carry the weight of him on top of everything else without it eventually crushing something she needed. He climbed down from the wagon and stood at the fence line and held his hat the way men hold hats when they're not certain of their reception, which is to say, by the brim with both hands, rotating it slightly. She walked out to meet him, not to welcome him in, not yet, just to meet him at the fence. "Rosalie," he said. "Papa." He looked older than he had on the day of the auction, which was only 2 months ago, which meant he'd been doing his own particular kind of carrying. His face had the quality of a man who has spent time with something uncomfortable about himself and has come out the other side not entirely whole, but at least no longer running. "I went to Webb," he said, "the marshal. I told him what I know about Blackwell's arrangements with the county judge, about the conversations I was part of." He looked at his hat. "I'm not saying it repairs anything. I know it doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. "What did Webb say?" "That my cooperation was noted." A pause. "He didn't promise anything. I didn't ask him to." She looked at her father. She thought about $8.40. She thought about the produce crate and the way he'd stared at his boots. She thought about the thin wall between their rooms and the sound of his pacing in the mornings. "You were already in Blackwell's debt before the auction," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." No deflection, no explanation, just yes. "He told you what to do." "He suggested it," her father said. "I chose it." He looked up then and met her eyes, which cost him something she could see. "That's not the same as being forced. I want to be honest about that." She hadn't expected that. The honesty of it landed differently than she'd anticipated. "I'm going to need some time," she said. "I don't know how much." "I know. I'm not saying no to whatever this is. I'm saying I don't know yet." He nodded, slow and genuine. "I understand that." He put his hat back on. "I heard what you did. About the records and the marshals. The whole valley knows." He paused. "I'm not saying that to make you feel good. I'm saying it because I need you to know that I know it. That I understand what kind of person you are and what kind of person I—" He stopped. "I know what I chose. She stood at the fence for a moment after he'd turned back to his wagon. She stood there until he was down the road and out of sight, and then she turned around and Silas was on the front step, where he'd been giving her the distance to have that conversation without company. "You all right?" he asked. She considered the question. "I will be," she said. "Not today, but I will be." He nodded like that was a complete and sufficient answer, because for him it was. The thing that no one had planned for, and that became necessary anyway, was what came after the legal resolution. After the foreclosures were overturned and the restitution process began, and Blackwell and Voss were in federal hands, and Webb packed up his temporary office and shook her hand and said, again, in his flat professional way, that it had been good work, and left. The Valley had to figure out what it was now. That sounds abstract, and it was, and it wasn't. Concrete things needed doing. The Dunmore family needed a fence repaired that had fallen during the weeks they'd been displaced. The Lindqvists needed help navigating the restitution paperwork because the forms were in English and complicated, and their oldest son, who was the family's best English reader, was 17 and had never dealt with federal legal documents. Old Clem Burris needed someone to check on him because he was 81 and had been alone on that property for 2 years, and the stress of the foreclosure threat had taken something out of him that wasn't entirely back. There were women in similar situations to the one she'd been in on the day of the auction. Not identical, nothing was identical, but the same general shape of vulnerability. A woman in the Valley's southern corner whose husband had left and whose name wasn't on any of the property documents because nobody had thought it mattered. A young widow with 2 children who'd been trying to hold her late husband's small operation together and who had no framework for understanding the freight records that showed she'd been overcharged for 18 months. Rosalie started by helping with paperwork. That was what she knew how to do, and it was what was needed, and she didn't dress it up as anything more significant than it was. She sat at kitchen tables and went through forms and explained legal language and showed people what the numbers meant and what they were entitled to and how to ask for it. But she kept thinking about what came after that, after the paperwork was done, after the immediate need was addressed. What happened to a person who had spent years being systematically diminished by poverty, by isolation, by the particular kind of helplessness that comes from not being able to read your own financial situation clearly enough to see what was being done to it? She thought about herself at 26, standing on a produce crate with $8.40 between her and whatever came next. She thought about what had changed between that morning and now, and the honest answer was that what had changed was access. Access to information, to documentation, to the framework for understanding what she was seeing. She'd always had the capability. The capability without access is just a thing you carry that has nowhere to go. She talked to Silas about it one evening, not as a proposal exactly, more as the thing she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks that had solidified enough to say out loud. "I want to use the barn," she said. "The east side. The part you're not using for equipment storage." He'd been mending a harness. He looked up. "For what?" "Classes," she said. "Bookkeeping. Basic accounting. How to read a contract. How to understand a loan document." She paused. "Literacy, for the people who need it. Reading and numbers both. Because you can't fight a rigged system if you can't read the documents it uses against you." He looked at her for a moment. "Who would come?" "I don't know yet. Probably not many at first." She was honest about that. It would take time. People would have to trust that it wasn't going to be used against them somehow. That's a reasonable fear to have. "It is," he agreed. He looked back at the harness. "The east side of the barn needs a new window. The existing one lets in drafts." She looked at him. "If it's going to be a classroom," he said, "it should have decent light." She sat with that for a moment. The practical, absolute simplicity of him. Not, "Are you sure?" or "Let's think about this," or any of the 17 questions she'd been prepared to answer. Just, "The window needs fixing if it's going to be used for something." "Thank you," she said. "It's a good use of the space," he said. "Hector would have liked it." Mabel Finch was the first person she told, because Mabel was the person whose opinion she'd learned to rely on for whether an idea was sound or merely appealing. Mabel listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, complete, assessing, undecorated by politeness. "Bookkeeping and literacy," Mabel said. "To start, we can expand what's offered as we understand what's needed." "Who teaches?" Me, for the accounting and numbers. For literacy, I was hoping. She stopped. Mabel looked at her. You were hoping I would. You run a business. You manage accounts. You've been in this valley for 19 years and you know every family in it and they trust you. She paused. And you're a better reader than I am. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, I can manage those. That's what I was thinking. And we don't turn anyone away for lack of money, Mabel said. Not a negotiation, a condition. No, Rosalie agreed. We don't. The first session, 3 weeks later, had 7 people. 3 of them were women. One was Tom Harmon's son, who came not because he needed the literacy instruction, but because he wanted to understand freight accounting well enough that no one could do to him what had been done to his family. One was the Lindqvist 17-year-old who had English but wanted to be able to read legal documents independently and not rely on anyone else to translate them for him. One was a woman from the southern end of the valley whose name wasn't on any property documents and who sat in the back and didn't say much but wrote down everything. And one was Daria Calloway, who didn't need any of it and came anyway and helped explain the accounting exercises to the people who were struggling because she'd spent 3 years trying to hold her late husband's operation together alone and understood, in her body, what it cost. By the 4th week, there were 14 people. By the 8th, 22. She didn't keep account after that because counting felt like the wrong way to measure it. Clement Mercer came back in the 3rd month. Not to the ranch. He sent a letter first, which was the right instinct. He said in the letter that he'd been sober for 6 weeks, which he said not as a bid for credit but as information, the same flat way he might report weather. He said he understood if she didn't want him to visit. He said he was going to do the thing he could do, which was continue talking to Webb's follow-up investigators about the county judge's involvement, and that he didn't expect that to constitute a repair of anything between them, but it was what he had. She wrote back. A short letter. She said he could come. He came on a Sunday and they sat on the front step because she still wasn't ready to invite him into the kitchen, into the room that was hers, in the way nothing had ever quite been hers before. They talked for an hour. It was not a comfortable conversation. It was also not as bad as she'd feared, which is usually the way with the things you've put off facing long enough that they've grown monstrous in the anticipation. He told her that he'd heard about the barn, about the classes. He said it awkwardly, without the right words for it, something like, people are saying good things about what you're doing up here. She didn't help him find better words. She let him say it the way he could say it. I made you less than you were, he said, toward the end of the hour. I mean, I tried to. I couldn't, but I tried. He looked at his hands. I don't know why I did that. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it a lot, in the quiet moments, the early mornings when the ranch was still and the thinking was honest. She'd come to something that wasn't an explanation, but was adjacent to one. You were frightened, she said, of everything, and I think it was easier to make me smaller than to do anything about the size of what scared you. He was quiet for a moment. That doesn't excuse it. No, she said, it doesn't. They sat there a while longer. He left before dark, the way people leave when they're not sure of their welcome for overnight, but don't want to presume. She watched him go and felt the complicated arithmetic of it. What she could give, what she couldn't yet, what she might be able to at some later point she couldn't currently see from here. It wasn't resolution. It was something more tentative and more honest than resolution. Silas, who had been inside the whole visit by design, came out after her father was gone. He came, he said. Yes. How was it? She thought about it. It was what it was, she said, which is not nothing. He nodded. He's not the same person, she said, or he's trying not to be. I don't know yet which it is. She paused. I don't know if that matters to me right now. What matters to me right now is whether I can put it somewhere that isn't between me and the rest of my life. Can you? She looked at the road where her father's wagon had gone. She thought about carrying things versus putting them down, and about the difference between forgetting and not letting something define you, which were 2 entirely different acts that people often confused. I'm working on it, she said. It was an October evening, the kind where the air has gone sharp and clean and the hills have their best color, when Silas asked her. They'd had dinner. She'd cooked because she'd gotten better at it over the months, and she genuinely liked it now, in a way she hadn't expected. the concrete satisfaction of a thing that can be completed. She'd made a decent beef stew, which she would not describe as remarkable, but which was warm and real, and made the kitchen smell like a place where people lived their actual lives rather than survived them. He'd washed the dishes. She'd dried them, which was a division of labor they'd arrived at organically, and that neither of them had commented on. She was putting the last plate away when he said, "Rosalie." Something in the way he said it was different. Not alarming. He'd never once alarmed her, in all these months, just different. She turned around. He was standing with the dish towel in his hands, looking at her with the expression of a man who has thought about something carefully for a long time and has decided to say it anyway. "I don't want to make an assumption," he said, "about what you want, or what you're ready for. I've watched you spend months figuring out what belongs to you and what doesn't, and I'm not going to muddy that." He paused. "But I'd like to court you. Properly. If that's something you'd consider." She looked at him, the dish towel in his hands, the kitchen that was hers as much as his now, in the way that things become yours when you've worked in them long enough. The window in the east side of the barn that he'd repaired himself before she'd had to ask. She thought about the first morning, the overcooked eggs, the notebooks on the table. She thought about him at the back of the crowd saying, "What does she want?" and waiting for her answer. She thought about Frank Reardon riding through the night with letters in his coat. She thought about all the things Silas had done in the past months that required nothing from her and asked nothing of her and had simply been there to be used or not as she chose. She thought about what it meant to choose something, genuinely choose it, from a position of having real options. "I'd consider it," she said. He let out a breath. Very small. She might have missed it. "All right," he said. "Not because I owe you anything. I know that. And not because I don't have somewhere else to go. I have somewhere else to go now. I have the barn and the classes and the families in this valley and Mabel and half a dozen things I've built that belong to me." She said this not to wound him, but because it was important, because the distinction between choosing and having nowhere else to go was the entire moral distance between what had been done to her and what she wanted her life to be from here forward. "I'd consider it because you're someone I'd choose." He looked at her for a moment. "That's more than I expected you to say." "I know," she said. "I'm practicing saying what I mean." He smiled then, not the careful, contained expression she'd seen in the first weeks, but something more open, something that changed his face in a way that made her aware she'd been seeing a partial version of it for months. "You've gotten good at it," he said. "I've had reason to work on it," she said. They were married the following spring. Not a large ceremony. Neither of them wanted that. Mabel Finch was there, and the Morrison brothers who'd come down from the south end of the valley and dressed better for it than she'd imagined them capable of. Tom Harmon and his son. The Lindquist family. All of them, including the 17-year-old who was 18 now and who was learning to read loan documents with a focus that she suspected would serve him very well for the rest of his life. Daria Calloway, who cried, which surprised everyone, including Daria. The young couple, the Garretts, who'd been afraid to sign and had signed anyway, and whose small operation had survived and was, by all evidence, beginning to actually thrive. And her father, at the edge of the group, not quite part of it but not entirely outside it either, which was the only arrangement she had to offer and which he accepted without complaint. The woman from the southern end of the valley, whose name was Clara and who had joined the barn classes in the 4th week and had not missed a session since, read something she'd written herself. Not a poem, just a few sentences about what it meant to understand the papers that governed your life, and to know that understanding was yours to keep. She read it haltingly, with the particular concentration of someone for whom reading in front of people is still an act of courage, and nobody in that group made a sound until she was finished. It was not a perfect day. The weather was changeable in the way of spring, and there was a period in the middle of the afternoon where it rained briefly and then stopped. Someone had brought a cake that listed slightly to the left. Silas's speech, if you could call it that, was 3 sentences long and ended with him appearing to run out of words, which made people laugh in the affectionate way people laugh at something that is entirely in character. She didn't make a speech. She thought about it and decided that the words she wanted to say were not ones that needed an audience. She said them later, when the others had gone and the ranch was quiet and the lamplight was doing what lamplight does in the evening in a house where people live. She said, "I didn't think it would be like this." He said, Like what? She thought about it. Like something I chose all the way down. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is that good? Yes, she said. That's the whole thing. That's exactly what's good about it. Us. The barn classes ran for years. Long after the legal resolution of the Blackwell case had faded into the particular category of things that had happened and been dealt with and become part of the settled history of the valley. Long after the new freight company that had taken over the routes, a cooperative model that several of the ranchers had organized together, which Rosalie had helped structure financially, had become simply the way things worked, unremarkable in its fairness. Because fairness, when it's operational long enough, stops feeling remarkable and starts feeling like the floor. She didn't solve everything. She was very clear about that, in her own mind, in the way she talked about it in the classes. The valley still had hard years and difficult men and injustice in various shapes she couldn't document her way out of. People still made bad decisions under pressure. The world outside Iron Bluff was very large and very old, and full of systems that had been rigged for a long time in ways that a woman in a barn couldn't fully address. What she could do was make sure that the people who sat at the tables in that barn walked out understanding what they were looking at when numbers were put in front of them. What she could do was make sure that the next Clement Mercer's daughter knew how to read the ledger her father couldn't. What she could do was make sure that when the next Blackwell arrived, and she had no illusions about whether the next Blackwell would arrive, because they always do, in one form or another, there would be more people in this valley who could see the pattern early enough to name it. That was the thing about what had happened in Iron Bluff. The fraud wasn't what was most important. The fraud was the occasion. What mattered was the isolation that had allowed it to operate. The kept separate, kept ashamed, I thought it was only me quality of how it had sustained itself for years. The remedy for that was not a single act of exposure, however necessary. The remedy was ongoing and slow and required people to sit in a barn on a Tuesday afternoon and be willing to not know things in front of each other, and to learn in front of each other, and to go home with information that belonged to them and couldn't be taken back. She thought about Hector Granger sometimes. About, "This isn't right," written in a notebook that nobody read for 14 months. About what might have happened if he'd lived long enough to find someone who could have shown him the full shape of what he'd seen the edge of. She couldn't know that. She let herself not know it. What she knew was that the notebook was on the shelf in the ranch kitchen, between the accounts ledger and the copy of the Valley's cooperative freight charter, and that Silas dusted it the same as everything else, with the same plain care he brought to all the things that mattered without announcing that they mattered. She knew that on the produce crate she'd been $8.40, and that she was now the woman who had built the thing in the barn and the network of people who came to it and the accumulated weight of years of work that was visible in the valley if you knew what you were looking at. She knew that those two facts existed in the same person, and that neither one canceled the other out, and that the distance between them was not luck or rescue, but the very specific human capacity to take the thing that was done to you and refuse to let it be the last word. She'd spent a long time believing that other people decided what she was worth. She'd been wrong about that. It had taken a produce crate and $8 and a man at the back of a crowd who asked a question nobody else thought to ask for her to start finding out how wrong. She didn't spend much time anymore thinking about Edgar Blackwell. He was in federal prison and would be for a significant number of years, and Henry Voss was beside him in the eyes of the law, if not in the same facility, and the county had a new sheriff and a new judge, and those facts were real and mattered and had required considerable effort to bring about. But they weren't the point. The point was the barn. The point was Clara, reading her own words out loud in front of people who listened. The point was the Lindqvist boy, who was a man now, reading his own contracts and understanding them and making decisions from a position of knowledge rather than fear. The point was Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and the sound of people learning something, and the specific quality of the quiet that settles in a room when a fact that was confusing becomes clear. That was what she'd built. Not out of revenge, and not out of the goodness of her heart exactly, and not because she'd become someone uncomplicated who had figured out a clean way to live. She'd built it because she was stubborn and had a head for numbers and was angry about a specific set of things in a specific place and time, and because Silas Granger had paid $8.40 and asked what she wanted, and she'd had to live long enough and work hard enough to find out what the full answer to that question was. It turned out the answer was this: not a single thing. A whole collection of ongoing things, Imperfect and sometimes frustrating and occasionally wonderful. The valley knew her name. They said it the way you say the name of someone who has been around long enough to be part of the landscape. Not with reverence, which she would have found uncomfortable, but with the matter-of-fact familiarity of someone who belongs. She did belong. She'd earned that, and she'd chosen it, and both of those things were true, and the combination of them was what made it real in a way that neither alone could have managed. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, she walked across the yard to the barn with her accounting ledger under her arm, and the door standing open the way it always stood open now, and she could hear from the yard the sound of people already inside, already talking,